They called it the cafes, the cage, a palace within a palace. A place where Ottoman princes were kept, not for punishment but for protection. From ambition, from betrayal, and most of all, from each other. In that silence, Prince Ibrahim grew up, born of empire yet denied its world. His days were measured not by seasons, but by the creak of the guard's sandals and the click of bolted doors. He was the son of Ahmed III, a sultan whose reign had once brought poetry and peace to the empire. But the Ottoman throne was never built on sentiment. It was carved from fear. When Ahmed died, Ibrahim was still a boy. His elder brothers fought for power, and those who lost disappeared. Ibrahim was spared, but mercy in the palace was rarely kind. He lived like a ghost in silk. His windows faced courtyards he could not touch. He was allowed food, tutors, and prayers, but not freedom. Even his sleep was guarded. They say he spoke little in those years, that he learned to whisper to the birds who perched by his window. Sometimes, when the palace servants changed his linens, they found torn scraps of poetry, half-written prayers to a world he'd never seen. The women of the harem pitied him, the forgotten prince. They brought him sweet figs and stories of the sea, but pity too can wound, and Ibrahim began to believe he was different, too fragile for the world, too holy perhaps for the sins of politics. Years passed. One brother ascended the throne, then another. Wars came and went, empires rose and cracked, but inside the cage nothing changed, except the child who waited. By the time he reached manhood, Ibrahim had spent 2 decades in confinement. He knew no cities, no battles, no friends, only the whispers of the palace, rumors of executions, betrayals, and the endless weight of fear. And yet, he dreamed. In the darkness of his room, he imagined the outside world as paradise, a realm of endless delight, unchained and pure. Freedom to him was not responsibility, it was temptation. One night, the locks that had kept him prisoner for 20 years finally turned. The guards bowed low. A trembling voice said, "Your Majesty, your brother is dead. You are Sultan now." The boy who had lived in shadows was suddenly crowned with the sun, and in that blinding light, something inside him began to fracture. Because Ibrahim had not been prepared to rule an empire, he had been prepared only to survive one. When Ibrahim stepped beyond the walls of his prison, the air itself felt unreal. The garden smelled of jasmine, and he stood there, frozen, as if scent alone could intoxicate him. For a man who had known only stone and silence, even sunlight was a kind of ecstasy. They dressed him in robes of gold and crowned him beneath the crescent banner. Drums thundered through Istanbul. The people cheered their new sultan, the long-lost prince now reborn. But behind those cheers, there was unease, because few had seen him in years, and fewer still knew what those years had done to his mind. At first, the palace bathed him in reverence. Viziers bowed low, scholars praised his piety, and his mother, the formidable Kosum Sultan, ruled quietly in his name. She thought she could guide him, as she had guided sultans before. But power, once tasted, awakens everything that sleep had silenced. Ibrahim wandered the palace like a dreamer walking through his own imagination. He touched the marble walls as if to prove they were real. Every sight, every sound, it all shimmered with newness. But beneath the wonder, there was hunger. A hunger born not of greed but of starvation. 20 years of deprivation had turned every desire into a wound that begged to be filled. He wanted to feel everything. To make up for the lost years, to drown in the world he had been denied. He listened to music until dawn, demanded feasts that could feed armies, and summoned storytellers to recite tales of love, conquest, and fantasy. The courtiers smiled. The empire could afford indulgence, they thought. After all, a happy sultan meant a peaceful court. But the cracks were already showing. Ibrahim's curiosity grew restless. He questioned the grand viziers one moment, then laughed at their solemn answers the next. He would change decrees without warning, ordering gifts for the poor, and then canceling them hours later. His moods shifted like tides, gentle, then wild, and all the while, his mother watched. She saw the tremor in his hands, the way his eyes wandered, searching for something beyond reason. Perhaps she recognized it, the madness that had haunted Ottoman bloodlines before. In the nights that followed, Ibrahim began to retreat into fantasy. He surrounded himself with entertainers, dreamers, and flatterers who told him what he longed to hear. that he was chosen, divine, invincible. Reality began to lose its edge. There is a story, whispered, not written, that one evening, Ibrahim called for every candle in the palace to be lit at once. Thousands of flames flickered across the marble halls, painting him in gold and shadow. He walked through them barefoot, laughing softly, saying, "At last, the sun obeys me." The servants bowed. The viziers exchanged glances. And Sultan, standing in the distance, whispered to herself, "The boy is still in the cage." Outside the palace walls, the empire waited for its ruler's command. Wars brewed, taxes soared, trade faltered. But inside Topkapi, time no longer moved in straight lines. Every hour became a dream, every pleasure an escape. The Sultan, who had once prayed for freedom, now feared only one thing: silence. He filled it with music, voices, laughter, anything to drown the echo of the cage he still carried within. And in that desperate pursuit of sensation, the seeds of ruin were sown. Because when a man mistakes pleasure for freedom, he becomes a prisoner once more, this time of his own desire. They say that power reveals the truth of a man. But for Sultan Ibrahim, power did not reveal, it unleashed. The once quiet prince of the cage was gone. In his place stood a ruler who mistook fantasy for law and hunger for destiny. And the palace, which had once echoed with prayers and politics, now throbbed with a different kind of rhythm, one born of excess. The viziers still gathered each morning, waiting for imperial decrees. But often Ibrahim would not appear. He would spend hours in his private chambers, lost in ornate dreams, demanding perfumes from distant lands, silks dyed in impossible colors, jewels to decorate every corner of his world. The treasury began to weep. Gold that once funded armies now gilded the ceilings of Topkapi. Ships that should have carried weapons and trade goods sailed instead with spices, wine, and luxuries from foreign merchants who learned quickly that the Sultan's desires knew no limit. And as his appetites deepened, truth became unwelcome. Those who warned him were silenced, exiled, or replaced by men who smiled too easily. Flattery became the only coin that spent well in the palace. The empire outside began to murmur. Governors complained of empty coffers, soldiers went unpaid, and the great Ottoman machine, once feared from Vienna to Baghdad, started to grind and cough. But within the marble walls, Ibrahim's world gleamed brighter than ever. He had built a palace of illusion and mistook it for the empire itself. They say a man who lives too long in mirrors forgets what his own face looks like. Ibrahim surrounded himself with reflections, tapestries of gold, fountains that shimmered like melted glass, and courtiers who told him what he wanted to see. Every indulgence was justified as divine. If he desired it, it was fate. If it pleased him, it pleased God, and yet, even surrounded by opulence, he remained restless. Pleasure once tasted fades like perfume, and to chase it, one must always want more. He became unpredictable, generous one day, merciless the next. He rewarded poets with palaces, then exiled them for a careless rhyme. He promised peace, then declared war over a rumor. Every decision was impulse wrapped in ceremony. The viziers feared him. But more than that, they pitied him. For in Ibrahim's eyes there was still that glint of the boy from the cage, the child who had never learned the difference between dream and reality. Freedom had not cured his confinement. It had only widened its walls. Beyond the council halls, another world turned, the world of the harem. It had always been the secret heart of the empire, but under Ibrahim it became something else entirely. Where past sultans found counsel or companionship, Ibrahim sought escape. He filled the chambers with music, laughter, and endless celebration, as if he could silence the weight of rule by drowning it in sound. Each night was more elaborate than the last, each gift more extravagant. Jewels sparkled even on the servants. Silk covered even the walls, but beneath the laughter, the empire groaned. Farmers starved while the palace overflowed. Gold melted into decoration instead of defense, and those who dared speak against the waste were accused of treason. Outside Istanbul, enemies began to move. Rebellion stirred in Anatolia. The Venetian fleets, long held at bay, advanced across the sea. Yet inside Topkapi, the Sultan was consumed by spectacle, unable or unwilling to see the storm gathering at his gates. The people whispered that their ruler had gone mad. But madness in a sultan was not merely a tragedy. It was a contagion. His court mirrored him. His ministers lied to please him. His soldiers obeyed without question, even when orders made no sense. An empire that had survived wars, crusades, and centuries of ambition was now being undone from within, not by enemies, but by indulgence. Sultan, the mother who had once protected him, could no longer look away. She tried to guide him gently, to remind him of duty, of the world beyond pleasure. But Ibrahim only smiled and said, "The empire will last forever, mother. It always has." And she who had seen sultans rise and fall felt a chill deeper than any winter, because she knew what he could not. No empire, no matter how divine, survives the blindness of its ruler. The marble halls glowed with candlelight. The fountains still sang, but beneath the music the cracks were spreading, invisible, silent, and unstoppable. The Sultan dreamed of eternity. His empire was already dying. The empire, once a gleaming jewel beneath the sun, now shivered beneath Ibrahim's hands. Every decision that had seemed playful or whimsical began to reveal its true weight. Governors sent urgent letters. Merchants demanded payment. Soldiers muttered of hunger and neglect. And still, the Sultan wandered through halls of gold and marble, lost in candlelight and mirrors. The people no longer cheered. Whispers spread like smoke through Istanbul. A sultan detached from duty, enthralled by indulgence, blind to consequence. Even the court began to fracture. Viziers who once flattered him now plotted in shadows, fearing the collapse that inevitably loomed. All the while, the mother who had once guided emperors silently observed. Sultan, the matriarch who had survived more sultans than most could name, faced an impossible choice. Her son, beloved and broken, was destroying the very empire she had fought to preserve. Could she protect him, even as he endangered thousands? Or protect the empire, even if it meant his ruin? The palace echoed with tension. She walked through the halls at night, listening to the faint sounds of laughter that no longer carried joy. The laughter of a man trapped by his own desires. "In the shadows," she whispered, "I cannot save both." History will demand one. Outside the gilded cages and fountains, rebellion stirred. Janissaries mutinied. Governors refused orders. Even the streets of Istanbul buzzed with quiet unrest. The Sultan's indulgence, once a curiosity, became intolerable. Every act of pleasure now carried a cost too high to ignore. The empire had waited, but patience was spent. And so, the coup began, not with armies crashing against gates, but with silent steps through corridors, with letters sent in secret, with alliances formed under candlelight. Ibrahim, lost in his private world, sensed nothing. He laughed as courtiers whispered urgently. He danced through halls of gold, unaware that the foundations of his reign were crumbling beneath him. Then came the moment no one could forget. The Sultan, surrounded by mirrors, candles, and music, was confronted by the reality he had evaded for so long. A messenger knelt before him. "Your Majesty, the empire no longer obeys you." For a moment Ibrahim laughed, but the laughter faded quickly, replaced by a tremor of fear he had never known. Sultan entered the chamber. Her face was calm, almost serene, but her eyes held the weight of centuries. She said nothing, for words could not undo what had been done. The coup was swift. The palace was silent except for the faint rustle of silk and the low murmurs of those who mourned the inevitable. Ibrahim was deposed, taken from the throne not in battle, but by the quiet, inexorable will of the empire itself. He did not resist. The boy who had lived in a gilded cage, who had dreamed of endless pleasure and freedom, finally understood the cage had been his own making. And in that final hour, the palace seemed to sigh. Marble walls, golden ceilings, fountains still singing, all bore witness to a reign that had burned too bright, too fast. Ibrahim spent his final days in quiet seclusion. No longer a sultan, no longer a boy in the cage, simply a man haunted by a life of extremes. Some say he whispered to the birds again. Some say he stared at the candles until they melted into pools of wax, reflecting the empire he had almost lost. Sultan, who had loved him fiercely, finally let go. She had saved the empire, but at a cost that no crown could measure. The empire endured. But the story of Ibrahim lingered, a warning whispered through corridors, through shadows, and through history itself. He was a sultan who had lived twice, first as a boy trapped in gilded silence, then as a man lost in golden excess. Both lives were prisons, and both left their mark on the empire he ruled so briefly, so recklessly. Ottoman history did not forget him. Chroniclers wrote of his whims, his eccentricities, and his failures, not merely as scandal, but as caution. For rulers who followed learned that power, when untamed, becomes a mirror reflecting desire, obsession, and fear back upon the throne itself. The people of Istanbul remembered too, though in quieter ways. Stories passed in hushed tones across markets and courtyards, of the Sultan who laughed too loudly, who dreamed too deeply, and who loved freedom so fiercely that he forgot responsibility. Ibrahim's life was more than history. It was a warning, whispered to every ruler who would follow. Beware the cage you cannot see. Beware the pleasures that blind you. Beware the throne that asks more than it gives. The boy who had spent 20 years in silence had taught the empire an enduring lesson, that confinement can twist the mind, and that freedom without wisdom can destroy everything it touches. Even in his madness there was tragedy. Even in his indulgence there was a longing, a hunger for what he had been denied. He was not merely cruel nor merely foolish. He was a man who had known too little of the world, yet had been asked to rule all of it. And in the quiet moments, when the palace was still and the wind whispered through open windows, perhaps he understood that his greatest enemy was not the empire, not the viziers, not even his mother. It was himself. History is a shadowed hall, lined with portraits of rulers, warriors, and dreamers. Some shine with glory. Some crumble in ruin. Ibrahim's portrait hangs differently. It does not gleam. It does not glow. It flickers like a candle struggling against the wind, reminding all who look upon it of the fragility of power, the weight of indulgence, and the perilous nature of desire. And so, the mad Sultan sleeps, long gone from the gilded halls, yet alive in the whispers of time. His story remains not as a tale of scandal, but as a dark lullaby for those who would hold the world in their hands, a reminder that the brightest flame can leave the deepest shadow.